All right. Welcome. Thank you for joining us today for our 46th episode of the Clements Bookworm. I'm Angela Unk, Director of Development at the Clements Library, and happy to spend the morning with you. Today's meeting is being recorded to share online. This afternoon, you will receive an email with the recording and resources mentioned during today's broadcast. Just in case you're joining us for the first time, I want to mention a few ways that we use Zoom. We're happy to have you chime in using the chat function. Please select everyone so we can all see your comments. My colleagues, Anne and Lily, will be posting helpful links and monitoring the chat. You'll notice, however, that the conversation goes by very quickly. So if you have specific questions, please put those in the Q&A section. You can also give a little thumbs up to upvote a question if it's one that you would like to ensure is asked during today's program. We also have the live machine captioning turned on today. You can toggle that on or off, and you can also change the size of the words. And we have side-by-side mode enabled. I can only control so much of what you see on the screen, so take a moment to play around with it. You can move the little slider back and forth to enlarge what you see for the slides versus the speaker. And hopefully all of this will help you have a good experience. The Clements Library's mission is to collect, preserve, share, and promote the study and discussion of primary sources related to all aspects of history and culture of North America and the Caribbean up to 1900. So we're happy to bring you this bookworm program today. I'd also like to acknowledge that the University of Michigan is located on the territory of the Anishinaabe people. In 1817, the Ojibwa, Ottawa, and Potawatomi nations made the largest single land donation to the University of Michigan, offered ceremonially as a gift in the text of the Treaty of the Foot of the Rapids, so that their children could be educated in a Western manner. We acknowledge the history of Native displacement that allowed the University of Michigan to be founded. Today, we reaffirm contemporary and ancestral Anishinaabeg ties to this land and their profound contributions to this institution. The William L. Clements Library acknowledges that it has and continues to benefit from the original land dispossession and the established hierarchies of settler colonialism. All right, so I am going to end the poll and share the results. It was fun having everyone participate and tell some stories about celebrity sightings. And it seems like most of us are somewhat shy when it comes to running into celebrities, and 64% of our participants selected admire from afar. And then we do have people who have the gumption to strike up a casual conversation, and a few of us actually go for the photos and the autographs. So I suspect that this is pretty common reaction when seeing someone who's famous. I'll go ahead and stop sharing that. And thank you, everybody, for participating in that fun poll. I'm happy to introduce Paul Erickson, who will be leading the discussion with Carolyn today. He is the Randolph G. Adams Director of the Clements Library. Paul received a BA in English from the University of Chicago and an MA and PhD in American Studies from the University of Texas at Austin. And he's been at the helm of the Clements Library, since since just before the pandemic hit in January of 2020. And so we're happy to have him join us today. Take it away, Paul.
Thanks, Angela. And I will say that one of the best parts of this job is welcoming old friends back to talk about their fantastic research. And Carolyn and I have been friends for, let's just say, over 20 years and not specify the number, but it's really fantastic to have her here today. Carolyn Eastman holds a PhD from Johns Hopkins, and she's taught at UT Austin. And as of like 2 weeks ago, is a full professor of history at Virginia Commonwealth University. So congratulations. During the 2021-22 academic year, she was in residence as a National Endowment for the Humanities Fellow at the New York Historical Society, developing her new book on New Yorkers' experiences of the yellow fever epidemics in the 1790s. Oh, something strange has happened to the screen. And she was also here at the Clements Library as a fellow during the past year as well. She is continuing that work in 22-23 as a public scholar, also funded by the NEH. Carolyn writes about early America and the Atlantic world, focusing on the intersections of gender, political culture, and the mediums of writing, speaking, and visual images. She's the author of 2 books. The first, A Nation of Speechifiers, Making an American Public After the Revolution, was published in 2009 by the University of Chicago Press. It was a finalist for the Best Book Prize from the Berkshire Conference for Women Historians, and was the winner of the 2010 Society for the History of the Early American Republic, James Broussard Best First Book Prize. Her second book, The Strange Genius of Mr. O, The World of the United States' First Forgotten Celebrity, was published last year by the Omohundro Institute and University of North Carolina Press, and is already gathering honors. It is a finalist for the Library of Virginia's Literary Award for Nonfiction, and was the winner of the 2022 Shear James Bradford Best Biography Prize. So Carolyn has swept the category of Shear prizes named after folks named James. And I'm sure the book is on its way to more honors. It is a tremendous book, and we have a discount code in the chat from UNC Press, so you can buy your own copy, which I encourage you to do. And Carolyn, take it away.
Oh, thank you, Paul, for that great introduction, and thank you to everyone at the Clements. You know, I spent a really happy period of time doing research there this spring, and what a magnificent collection and building you have. It's just an amazing place. And thank you for joining me here this morning. I love talking about this book. I said at some point that I would never enjoy writing a book as much as I enjoyed writing this one. And so I'm hoping that I can convey some of that joy to you today. So I'm going to share my screen here and get this going. Okay, so I want you to imagine a United States that was hopelessly divided politically, racially, along social and cultural lines. Religious groups disagreed and distrusted one another. A United States that was deeply in the midst of discord, to the extent that people really worried whether the United States could survive. I'm talking, of course, about the early 19th century. And I think that what's really interesting about the early 19th century is that we often think about the post-revolutionary period as being one when people had come together. The Americans had come together to fight the British, and they formed this new United States, and the Constitution drew everyone together. That was not the case. And in fact, if you look at this map, I think you can see that the United States, even in today's terms, was quite vast. In fact, just let me point out the very strange portrayal of the state or the area of Michigan here. Every time I look at this map, I think, wow, they hadn't spent much time in Michigan at all. Anyway, this was a situation that really troubled people. In fact, you see in leaders' letters how much they worried whether, the United States could survive this period. And into this environment, though, in the early 19th century, there appeared a man who rose to the state of being a celebrity. And this figure is, of course, forgotten today, and there are good reasons for that I'll be happy to discuss if you like. But he, in some ways, had a lot of the stereotypical and much mocked characteristics of celebrities today. He was narcissistic. He had a lot of glamorous friends. He wore eccentric clothing. He had often scandalous religious views. He had a deep and profound narcotics problem. And he even told people at the time that he was the heir to an earldom in Scotland, something that did not turn out to be true, but people tended to believe. And I think that a lot of these characteristics seem almost mockable today because they're so familiar, but at the time, none of that was typical. And in fact, nobody thought those problems were particularly troubling. And he had a wide array of supporters and friends and boosters, people like the President of the United States, Thomas Jefferson, the novelist Washington Irving, the great American physician Benjamin Rush, John Quincy Adams, Ralph Waldo Emerson, a wide array of elite women. And all of them were supporting him for reasons that are quite unique to the early United States. They were supporting him because he was such a great orator. And I want to talk about two things. First of all, celebrity. Now, when I talk about celebrity, I realize that a lot of us probably feel exhausted by celebrity today. We live in a culture that's inundated with celebrities. We often, walk through the supermarket checkout line and see those gossip rags and think, I don't even know who that is, and yet they're calling them a celebrity. I think that there are a lot of reasons to think of celebrity as a topic that is light, it's unserious, it's frivolous. But I want you to step back and think about the ways that celebrity actually offers us a mirror of the people who we are. So if Americans are obsessed or eager to debate the merits of the Kardashians or Beyonce or Lin-Manuel Miranda, that says a lot about who we are now. The people we choose to identify with, that we choose to admire because they're talented and beautiful and they wear great clothes, that says a lot about who we think we are and who we think we ought to be. And so I think that looking at someone in the early 19th century who was celebrated, and they used the term celebrity all the time, with regard to Ogilvie, it offers us a mirror for the early American Republic, a period when a lot of people were, again, deeply divided, and yet they were able to come together to debate Ogilvie's merits, to debate his talents, to debate whether he was good for the country, and so on. And they literally came together when he did his performances of oratory. They bought tickets to his talks, they sat in a room together, and he led them through discussions of some of the most important civic issues of the day. Things like female education, gambling, dueling, suicide. I mean, a lot of these topics may sound random maybe today, but at the time, these were some of the most hot button issues of the time. And so when he talked about, for example, dueling, which was a deeply controversial sort of practice, a very widespread, not just in the South, as we know from the Hamilton-Burr duel. He often tried to talk about the reasons to discuss it on both sides. So he would offer reasons to denounce dueling, but he would also talk about the function that it played in American society. Likewise with suicide, he tried to make Americans maybe soften some of their hard objections to suicide by discussing the ways that we ought to feel a lot of sympathy for those with suicidal ideation. So in a lot of ways, his talks brought people together literally, but his celebrity and the way that people talked about him also began to bring people together, even if only to debate whether he was good for the country. He wound up performing in states all over the United States. He traveled for 13 years. And in fact, I just want to show you this map one more time, because if you notice, each one of these dots appearing on the screen represents at least 5 lectures during his first 4 years of lecturing, starting in 1808. He traveled first, sort of up the East Coast and a bit into the interior, but then he also traveled into upstate New York. He traveled into lower Canada. He wound up going into the deep South, out west to Kentucky and Tennessee and Ohio, into the Indiana and Illinois territories. He was very widely traveled, and this is just in his first 4 years. And one of the things I try to talk about in the book is how remarkable this is, because traveling was so difficult at the time. I mean, if you imagine that even just traveling from Columbia, South Carolina to Lexington, Kentucky would have taken him several weeks on horseback, begging for places to stay along the way, because they didn't have a lot of taverns where he might rent a room. It gives you a sense of how remarkable his career was. He ultimately visited 17 of the United States' 19 states, as well as 2 territories, parts of Lower Canada, and then he traveled to England and Scotland to continue his celebrity career there. So within 13 years, he covered an enormous amount of ground. And I want to talk about oratory here right before I wrap up, because I think that it seems, again, today to be sort of an antiquated topic, that something that is maybe more quaint about the 19th century. But I think that if you consider that the United States was really the first republic in the Western world anyway, since the classical republics of Greece and Rome, you can understand why a lot of Americans felt it was important that their political leaders have skills in public speaking. And the fact was that their political leaders did not have good skills in public speaking. George Washington famously was a reluctant speaker. He couldn't speak from memorized speeches, so he often carried his notes in his hand, but then sort of awkwardly tried to gesture with the opposite hand. He'd shift the notes and try to, anyway, the people found that embarrassing. Thomas Jefferson was barely able to do public speaking at more than a whisper. James Madison, mumbled his words. Rufus King apparently tended to freeze when he was trying to do his talks. And so in a lot of ways, there were people very anxious that if you looked at the classical republics of Greece and Rome, you had these magnificent public speakers, people like Cicero and Demosthenes, who could not just articulate their culture's problems, but manage to make arguments for how their society should move ahead. And I know that in my own lifetime, I have felt better when we had, the United States now had political leaders who were gifted orators, because again, they helped to bring people to an understanding of the stakes of whatever political crisis that was in front of the American people. And so I think that in this way, you can understand why many Americans felt that if the United States had gifted orators at the center of their culture, they could resolve a lot of the divisions that really riddled the United States during this time. I also just want to say that public speaking was not just having a great voice, having a great talk in front of you. It was physical. It was something that you really performed, sometimes almost athletically. And there were guidebooks to public speaking like this one that really showed exactly how you model different kinds of emotions on stage. And if you imagine that Ogilvie was sometimes speaking before audiences of 600 people, 800 people, it was very, and again, in an era without any kind of amplification, he needed to express his emotions physically so that even those who couldn't hear him would be able to understand the emotions of what he was saying. And, you know, again, he was very rarely speaking from the kind of the image that we often have of early theaters. He didn't perform in theaters. He tended to perform in other spaces like state houses or in churches or in taverns that had a ballroom, often on the second floor. And so he struggled to make himself heard, and having these gestures helped people experience the majesty of what he did. They also really tended to describe him in almost these ecstatic terms that contrasted with his physical appearance in private. So this is a typical one. He is tall, lean, and badly formed, his cheekbones high and prominent, his shoulders narrow and round. Indeed, his whole figure is rather ungraceful, but when he speaks, you forget his personal defects. His eye, which is bright and quick, bespeaks the energy of his mind. It is the orator then only that claims your attention and leads captive your every feeling. And Washington Irving, likewise, had a similar sort of account. He was a pale, melancholy-looking man with a meager, pallid countenance and an awkward and embarrassed manner. But when he spoke, the change in the whole man was wonderful. His form would acquire a dignity and grace. His long, pale visage would flash with a hectic glow. His eyes would beam with intense speculation, and there would be pathetic tones and deep modulations in his voice that delighted the ear and spoke to the heart. So overall, then, what my book, The Strange Genius of Mr. O, does is not just try to help us understand why oratory was seen as so significant to the early American Republic. It really tries to use Ogilvie's career, the ups and downs, the scandals and the triumphs, all to help us understand a full picture of the early American Republic. The people who admired him, the people who hated him, the people who noticed that when he was performing on stage in a toga to remind people of the classical past, they didn't find that weird or mockable. They also didn't seem to mind his claims to be an earl in Scotland. They didn't seem to mind the fact that he had an opium habit that would probably have choked a horse. All of these things, all of the things that seem maybe confusing and silly to us now, did not appear that way in the early American Republic. And so in that way, I wanted to tell a story about the Republic that help us understand a larger picture than we normally do. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing and go back and hopefully have not just a conversation with Paul, who, yes, I have known for quite a long time, but also to answer some questions from the audience. I'd love to do that. So yeah, let's go.
Great. Thank you so much, Carolyn. And just a reminder for people who have questions, please put them in the Q&A field, and we will pitch them to Carolyn as they come in. But I have a few questions to start off. So the subtitle of your book calls Ogilvie the United States' first forgotten celebrity. But he's clearly not totally forgotten since you found him. So just talk a bit about how you came across Ogilvie and how you came to this project.
Yeah, well, I had never heard of him. I stumbled across him a bunch of times when I was writing my first book, actually. My first book was about how Americans after the Revolution learned to understand themselves through writing and speaking, but also through being readers and listeners to public oratory. And I just kept finding Ogilvie in diaries and letters, people talking about him. And so I looked him up and found that indeed he was an eccentric character. And I just never thought about it. I in the first book, I was focused on looking at, non-elite women and men who were experiencing oratory. But then, in the years after, I started noodling around, just seeing what there was about him and using some of the incredible digital access that we now have to printed sources as well as to manuscript sources. I began uncovering this remarkable archive of stuff. And I don't know. I mean, Paul, I feel like I talked to you when I was first uncovering this stuff, and I couldn't believe it. I couldn't believe how much stuff there was. And so I thought, well, I'll write a little article. And then the next thing I knew, I was writing what I called a short book, and then it turned into a regular sized book in the end. So yeah, he's one of those people who I think could have remained just a kind of maybe comical figure in a few people's writing if no one had bothered to sort of start looking for this person.
Right. No, I remember talking to you about him when you were first starting to work on this project. And I read a decent amount of stuff about early 19th century America, and I never heard of this guy. And then I read your book, and you lay out so well how extensively he traveled and who his like the networks that he was part of. And it's amazing that people don't know who he was. So you talked a bit in your talk about the spaces where he performed. I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about that. So most of our listeners have been in preserved early American churches. They know what theaters are like, but can you talk a bit more about the other spaces where he performed, and what did it feel like to be in those spaces watching this strange man in a toga?
Yeah, well, I've watched my fair share of period dramas on PBS, so I had an image of, again, the lovely theaters with the box seats and the upholstered chairs. That was a far cry from the spaces where he was performing. He usually performed in rooms that were used for dances or for maybe a town meeting. And so, I mean, there aren't a lot of these spaces left, but they were spaces designed to have big open floors for all kinds of gatherings. So you might be in a little town where you would have a 4th of July dinner, and they'd set up a bunch of tables in it. When Ogilvie came, they set up benches. So they just put a whole lot of benches into the room, and people came in and took their seats. There were people, and he remembered this in his crazy memoir of his life. He talked about how there were drunk people, often sitting in the front row, snoring or heckling him. There were people dressed in their very best gowns because they were so excited to see this celebrated speaker. But they were spaces that could hold anywhere from maybe 100 people to 600 or 800 people, depending on the size of the city. And so, when he was in Charleston, he was able to speak to huge audiences. But when he was in maybe a little town outside of Pittsburgh called Washington, Pennsylvania, he was speaking to maybe 100 or 125. And so, yeah, they were rooms intended to have multiple uses.
Mm-hmm. So this type of public speaking or oratory that he practiced seems kind of odd now, even though there are lots of performance genres that are kind of similar. So stand-up comedy or, one-person shows are functionally the same. It's a person on stage by themselves talking. Can you talk a bit more about other sort of popular performance genres from the period that Ogilvie was sort of part of the same milieu, and sort of what those were like?
Yeah, I mean, we also have things like TED Talks. I mean, that might be a good analogy to what Ogilvie was doing. Um, his talks were a little unusual in that he would get up on stage for about 90 minutes and again talk about these issues of civic importance. So if he showed up in your town, he might schedule a room where he would speak for a series of 4 weeks and maybe do 2 talks a week or something along those lines. And other people who were doing this were like magicians, or people doing experiments with electricity, people who maybe were speaking on other kinds of scientific projects, but there were also performers of all kinds, people performing ventriloquism for an audience, or people discussing American history, or people doing acrobatic tricks. There was one guy who called himself, I'm gonna misremember what he called himself. No, it's the Antipodean whirligig. So he did these sort of athletic tricks where at one point he would spin around on his back with firecrackers on his feet, spinning and sort of showing off, the light show. So there were all kinds of performers, but also educators doing this kind of stuff. And I mean, when you look at early American newspapers, I think what you start to realize is there were a lot of people, hoofing it all over the country, doing these kinds of performances, maybe showing off their learned pig who could count and, answer questions. So, yeah.
So, I mean, one thing that's fascinating to me about him is that he was, a lot of the discussions of him talked about his looks and his appearance, and he's this sort of tall, gaunt, strange-looking person in a toga, and yet there don't seem to be any period prints of him.
Right.
Is that just because the American print industry wasn't sufficiently developed, or can you talk a bit about why there are no images of what he looked like from the time?
Yeah, this is one of the things that confounded me a little bit. I mean, on the one hand, you'd be hard pressed not to call him a celebrity in the way that they talked about him, in the way that he was discussed, even when he wasn't anywhere close to an area. And yet the United States had a primitive enough print culture that they didn't have things like gossip rags, discussing his mistakes and scandals and so on. And there weren't a lot of great print making apparatuses. And so people were not, I mean, maybe because he was sort of a haunted looking figure, they didn't want to buy pictures of him. Whereas if you look at a similar culture in Great Britain at the time, someone like Lord Byron, who was very much a celebrity, not just for his gifts, but also for his sexual peccadillos, his scandalous adventures through life. There were any number of great prints of him showing his beauty, but he also had the aristocratic title to go with, and so on. And so, yeah, it's really striking to see that it was not until he went to London in 1817, he began to sit as a model for a group of artists there. And at that point, they start to produce images of him, but at that point, they did these images, all of him in the guise of Don Quixote, which is an absolutely apt kind of reference for him. But he also, I think, had a lot of the haunted, skinny, sort of the sunken eyes and so on, that would make that reference even clearer to people.
So I have one last question, and then we'll get to the questions in the Q&A. So, at the Clements, we get to see people deep in the archival weeds, grappling with the sources that they're hoping to turn into articles and books. And there's always so much research that people do that doesn't make it into the final product. And so, do you have a favorite story or part of Ogilvie's narrative that wound up on the cutting room floor that just didn't make it in?
Yeah, so one of the things I really tried to hunt down and understand were the times when he really was at the center of a scandal. And one of those scandalous moments that I was not able to figure out happened in Albany, New York. He spent a couple of different periods of time there. And there was one newspaper in Albany that referred obliquely to some kind of a scandal that he had been at the center of. And I have no idea what they're referring to. It was so vague. I tried looking in all kinds of other archives for letters that might explain what was going on. The other newspapers in the city really denounced that newspaper writer for referring to something without explaining it. And I think a lot of them said things like, how dare you condemn this magnificent figure who we all admire, and so on. And so I've always thought that at some point I'm going to find that archival collection that explains what it was. Did he flirt with someone he shouldn't have flirted with? Which at no other point did I find that happening. Did he get caught having sex with a man? I mean, that seems possible, but did he say something scandalous? That's even more likely. I have no idea, but this one newspaper article is really, it's haunted me ever since, and I sort of feel as if eventually I'll figure out what this scandal was all about.
Right. Well, I just want to encourage people to buy this book. It has, in addition to all of the fantastic qualities that we've talked about here, it has the best last chapter of any book I've read in a long time. And, there are spoilers, and so I'm not going to talk about that last chapter, but buy the book for the last chapter, and then the rest of it is a bonus. So I'm going to turn to some of the questions that are in the Q&A, and the first question is from.
Hey, can I do a couple of housekeeping things?
Sorry. Yeah, go ahead, Angela.
Q&A? Sorry. All right. I just want to make sure, and so put your questions in the Q&A. We're ready for them. Next month in September, we will welcome Mark Clegg to the Bookworm for a discussion about his recent book, Oh Say Can You Hear? A Cultural Biography of the Star-Spangled Banner. Mark Clegg holds several leadership roles at the University of Michigan School of Music, Theater, and Dance, including Associate Dean for Collaborations and Partnerships, as well as Professor of Musicology and Entrepreneurship and Leadership. In his research, he has examined the Clements Library's copy of a rare first edition of the Star-Spangled Banner. So I hope you'll all join us for that next month. Once you've signed up for the Bookworm, until you cancel, you are signed up for the series. And so you're welcome to join us live, or you will receive an email after the production with a link to the recording that you can watch at your leisure. I also would love to draw your attention to our student curated exhibit, Navigating Disability in 19th Century America. Through August 26th, you can stop by the Clements to view the exhibit at your leisure from 12 to 4:30 p.m. Monday through Friday. And in addition, for Welcome Week next week, we have tours happening on Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday at 4:15. So we'd love to have you come in and check out this wonderful student curated exhibit. If you haven't yet taken a look at our Zooniverse project, Picturing Michigan's Past, I encourage you to click on the link and just see what that's all about. We're asking for lots of help categorizing 60,000 real photo postcards of Michigan. The topics vary wildly, and it's been a lot of fun to see what's out there, and it's very easy to participate and will make a big impact in how researchers and the public are able to view these postcards. And last but not least, we really appreciate your participation in this program. If you're interested in sponsoring a future episode of the Bookworm, please contact myself or Ann Bennington-Helber, and we appreciate all of your support. Okay, and now we can go to the questions.
So, Carolyn, there's several questions about how Ogilvie made a living. So how did he support his traveling and appearances? How much did he charge for his talks, and how much, specifically, how much did he charge in relation to celebrities today? Sort of how much did it cost to go see him compared to?
Yeah. Well, he had no agent or any other publicity people to help him along. He did everything himself. But that meant that he got the lion's share of the money as well. So he charged tickets. I mean, he charged about $1 a ticket, which was significant. You know, that was equivalent to what a working man could make in a day. So, you know, his talks were something that really only those of middling and elite status could afford, people with discretionary income. I apologize. There's a truck endlessly backing up in my neighborhood. So anyway, so he made a living doing that. And you can imagine that when he showed up in a city or a town, it often took him anywhere from 2 to 4 weeks just to get ready to start giving his talks, because he had to find a venue. He had to figure out how to organize the space. He often, if he was, you know, speaking in a room that was used for dances and that kind of thing, he would have a small stage constructed of about 2 feet high so that people could see him better. And he had to buy a lot of candles for the door, you know, so that people could see. And that often, you know, in addition to his housing and getting himself put up, cost a significant amount of money before he earned a penny in that city. And yet, if he was speaking to maybe 100 to 125 people a night, he could ultimately make quite a lot of money as he went through. And so he really did make a pretty good living, which he also spent, you know, on taking breaks. He spent about 6 months in Kentucky not doing anything, and wound up losing a wallet at one point with $175 in it in Ohio. And you can imagine losing all your money you know, in one swoop. But he didn't have a bank that he could use as he was traveling around the country. So it on the one hand, he made plenty of money to support himself. And especially once he really got going and was able to speak in areas like New York City and Philadelphia and Charleston, places where, you know, everyone wanted to go and be seen in his audiences.
And his opium habit was presumably not inexpensive.
Well, it was probably the least expensive of his habits because opium was really cheap at that time. It was really affordable and it was everywhere. I mean, you know, we think about it now as being something that's regulated, that's difficult to get hold of and so on. I mean, just think about, I don't know if you've ever had pain medication prescribed by your doctor, but for him, you know, he could have gotten it from a landlord or a printer down the street or any kind of merchant. Opium was everywhere. The only time it became more expensive was during the embargo of the, you know, period around 1808. But for the most part, yeah, I mean, the problem was not the expense. It was that his need for opium kept getting greater and greater and greater. And that had real physical effects on his emotional and physical health.
So Susan has a question. Did Ogilvie ever seek any political or other type of administrative position? And if not, what was his motive for giving all these talks about these important subjects?
That's a great question. No, he never sought any kind of political office. And I think probably knew that was not for him. But he did, before he became a public speaker, he had been a school teacher for 15 years in Virginia. And in fact, that's where he really developed his knack for public speaking. And during that time, he realized two things. Well, maybe he realized three things. And one of them was that opium really helps you if you're a school teacher. But another thing was that he was exhausted by school teaching. It was a really hard job, even though he had remarkable skills as a teacher. And so the more time he spent on the road giving these talks, the more he began to fantasize about having a more permanent and more comfortable role in education. And so he began to sort of hint that he would love to be a visiting lecturer or a visiting professor at one of America's colleges. And he did have one of those gigs at the University, well, what is now the University of South Carolina. At that time, it was called South Carolina College, and had a great success there, but was never able to convince the South Carolina legislature to create a new professorship of rhetoric. But that's the kind of job he was seeking. And in fact, he wound up coming into contact with quite a number of figures, including John Quincy Adams, who was a fan of Ogilvie's, who had those kinds of positions. At the time, Adams was the, was it Boylston Professor of Rhetoric at Harvard? So that's the kind of gig he was ultimately seeking. And his larger goal was really to convince Americans that they needed a bigger place and more venues for this kind of public speaking. Again, to bring people together and to try to forge a pathway through all the discord in the early United States.
So Sue Jester has a question about how male and female celebrities in this period differed. And she wonders, was Ogilvie playing with different styles of masculinity?
Oh, hey, Sue, nice to see you. That's a great question. You know, the one female celebrity of this period that I'm really thinking of is the one discussed by Charlene Boyer Lewis in her great book on Elizabeth Patterson Bonaparte, a woman who became celebrated in part because of her beauty, but also the fact that she married Napoleon's nephew. And she was someone who became celebrated in many ways because of her physical appeal and her association with royalty, right? And so, and I'm trying to think of, it was a little bit later that you started to have women becoming celebrated as stage actors and in other roles as dancers and singers. And so I think that Ogilvie in some ways was modeling a certain kind of male, a good male leader kind of role. And I think I have a chapter on his toga and what that signaled. And in that, I try to unpack the sort of gendered meanings of the toga and how it really did convey a certain kind of an eagerness to be seen as worthy, as a good man, and as someone who is quite maybe strong and forthright in his beliefs, a righteous man. And so in that way, I think that male and female celebrity, they were quite different at this time, even as women who became known also tried to sort of model and perform femininity in very specific ways. For Ogilvie, it was really his eagerness to be seen as a good man, but to signal a pathway forward for the United States to have better male leaders who had the ability to convey the best kinds of ideas to their listeners.
So Michael Winship asks if his orations appeared in print.
Oh, that's a great question. Yes and no. So when he was a school teacher in Richmond, he gave a series of political talks that were published in the newspaper, and he published one of his orations in the newspaper at that time. But then during his period of celebrity, so beginning in 1808 and ending in 1820, what's really interesting is that none of them appeared in print. He promised ultimately that he would publish a book of his lectures, but that never happened, in part because of yet another scandal that put an end to his publishing career. But one of my greatest finds along the way as I was doing my archival research was in Louisville, Kentucky. I was trying to hunt down anything I could find about his performances there. And I called up a collection of manuscripts under someone else's name that seemed to indicate that there was a collection of lectures in it. And I realized going through the papers that they were Ogilvie's handwritten lectures, and that I recognized the handwriting, I recognized the topics, I recognized the kind of style of writing. I was amazed to find this collection at that time unidentified. That, of course, now they have identified them as Ogilvie's. So I have a collection of, I think, 5 of the lectures he was giving along the way, and they're quite different than what you would think. They often provoke listeners to consider difficult questions, and they often, again, move in this kind of dialectical style between speaking to people on one side of the issue and then speaking to people on the other side of the issue. So if there was a cultural debate about female education, for example, he would speak on both sides of what female education ought to look like, before ultimately trying to lead people toward advocating for greater female education. So no published lectures from his period of celebrity, and yet I did find this really remarkable archival collection.
So James has a question. Were Ogilvie's physical appearance and oratorical ability inherited or acquired talents? Sort of how did he become who he was?
That's a really interesting. I think people at the time would have always said that there's a little bit of both that goes into it. So Ogilvie was the son and the grandson of ministers in Scotland. And so he was someone who had been witnessing people up in front of audiences doing their thing, since the time he was born. On the other hand, education at the time, both in Scotland and in the United States, very strongly emphasized the acquisition of speaking skills. And so he would have studied the orations of the classical greats, Cicero, Demosthenes, Seneca, and all the rest, from the time he was a little boy, and would have learned how important it was for public leaders to have those kinds of talents. And they, by the late 18th century, when he was a college student and then as a young teacher in Virginia, he would have also had access to classical manuals for public speaking. And so a lot of them were advocating certain kinds of, ways of holding the body, in addition to the many, many manuals for public speaking designed for anyone from lawyers to ministers to stage actors and people like Ogilvie who wanted to be orators. They are the ones, as in the image I showed, that demonstrate the physical sort of postures and gestures and facial expressions and where to put your feet and so on. All of those things would have helped him practice, the art of oratory. So, oratory was an art, it was a craft, and it was something that perhaps he inherited in that everyone talked about the tenor and range of his voice. So he probably had, again, inherited some kind of a gift for oratory from a young age.
So Tammy asks if there was any debate with the audience as part of his programs, or aside from the drunks in the front row, or were his talks just sort of one-sided?
They were one-sided. Although when he was especially badly heckled, he did respond and sometimes step off the stage to go up to people and address them. Again, something he discusses in fascinating ways in his kind of kooky memoir written late in his life. So yeah, they were one-sided, and that was probably typical of the time. That is, you know, there's a kind of way that that scene of an oration or a sermon, it models a certain kind of understanding of how society ought to be. You have a leadership figure at the front of the room, someone who's very often a white man of certain kind of status, and an audience, you know, who ideally is behaving itself, you know, sort of filing back. Often in a church, the audience was organized by status as well, with the richer people sitting in the front and getting poorer and more inclined to be a minority as you go back or up into the gallery. And so, yeah, Ogilvie was very much participating in that kind of an image of an orderly society and, you know, at least ideally an orderly society. And so, yeah, I think that in a lot of ways, it's interesting that he didn't have more interaction with the audience compared to later in the 19th century, when audiences famously, you know, would not just heckle a listener, but also ask them to stop speaking and do something that they wanted to do. There are great accounts of early American theater audiences where they demanded that the play stop so that they could a major actor could just repeat one of those great speeches of Shakespeare's. And so, yeah, it's really remarkable the extent to which that wasn't happening, according to Ogilvie. And I think he would have told us if it was.
So Cheryl has questions about both precursors of Ogilvie's and then people he might have influenced. So she raises the question about George Whitefield and the First Great Awakening and sort of his impact compared to Ogilvie, and was there any influence there? And then you mentioned John Quincy Adams. Did Ogilvie have any influence on him in terms of oratory?
Yeah, so Whitefield, you know, as I was thinking about other celebrated speakers, Whitefield came up all the time for me, because I mean, he was somebody, again, who traveled the American colonies in the sort of mid to later 18th century, giving powerful, amazing sermons. He was also somebody who used newspapers incredibly effectively to drum up audiences, to get people excited about his talks. But he was someone who was thoroughly dedicated to his evangelical mission. And Ogilvie was, in contrast, a really avowed atheist, which was scandalous to many people at the time. And, you know, at the time, it's also interesting to think about the ways that in the early 19th century, you had another wave of evangelists covering the country, right? These sort of fire and brimstone speakers, people very often untrained in school, in any kind of theological seminary, who had remarkable skills in exciting people and terrifying them with the fear of hell, urging them to come to God. A lot of those evangelical speakers were having not just a remarkable effect on the audiences they reached, but they had a terrifying effect on other people who were more dedicated to more staid versions of Christianity. And Ogilvie's effect on audiences and his willingness to talk about his atheism to anyone who would listen, although never from the stage, I should say, indicated that maybe for some, they should have been worried about Ogilvie. That is, he had the same kind of remarkable effect on his listeners. And so there was a threat maybe in Ogilvie of demagoguery, someone who, again, had a terrific, charismatic presence, who could woo audiences. And there were people at the time who really feared that he was advocating for maybe atheism to spread more widely, or maybe he had other goals in mind. And so some of the scandals that erupted around him had to do with his scandalous religious views of the era. So I think that more than anything, the effect the influences he had were probably other learned figures rather than someone like Whitefield or some of the early Lorenzo Dow, other kinds of evangelists. But he did have an effect not on John Quincy Adams, although Adams went to see him multiple times and wound up, inviting him for dinner. They had these wonderful dinner parties. But Ogilvie did speak in front of an audience that included Ralph Waldo Emerson, who was a teenager at the time. And Emerson, of course, went on not only to have an incredible public speaking career on the Lyceum circuit. The Lyceum circuit got started around probably the mid 1830s for people like Emerson, who traveled widely and got started earlier for more local speakers. But Emerson wound up speaking quite a bit about the art of eloquence and the importance of eloquence in a republic. And so I think that in a lot of ways, when we think of the 19th century culture of oratory, we think about Abraham Lincoln, we think of Frederick Douglass, we think of Susan B. Anthony, we think of Sojourner Truth, a lot of people advocating for various kinds of reform, but also political speakers like Daniel Webster and Henry Clay and others. And I think that in a lot of ways, Ogilvie really helped to spearhead a new attention to and preoccupation with oratory. He, like I say, died in 1820, but within 10 years, you start to see what they ultimately called a golden age of American eloquence booming, eloquence emerging from the halls of Congress, from the Lyceum stage, from other kinds of religious organizations. And so oratory became increasingly important and really a vital aspect of American culture through at least the later 19th century. So I think that Ogilvie's influence, he was, long forgotten by the late 19th century, but I think that his influence was great.
And you touched on another question that was asked, which was about his influence on the Transcendentalist movement. And so I think that connection with Emerson is really, really fascinating. Marjorie asks, having worked in New York in advertising, she recalls the famous ad agency Ogilvie, Benson and Mather, and wonders if there's any connection between this Ogilvie and the king of early 20th century advertising.
I doubt it. Anyone who's traveled in Scotland knows that that country is just rotten with Ogilvies. I tried to hunt down a lot of the genealogical connections. He was also related to a number of people whose last name was different. And so he did have a few Virginia cousins, but he did marry. He married when he was a school teacher in Richmond. But his wife died only a little more than a year after their marriage. And I'm not entirely sure why she died. All of that is a little bit mysterious. I mean, it could have been in childbirth. It could have been another kind of, one of the many conditions that people had at the time, what we now call tuberculosis. It could have been a form of cancer, but he never married again. And as far as I know, never had any kind of significant attachment to another person, as far as I know. And it was something that he had to really behave himself doing. But as a result, he never had children. And one of the really remarkable things is that he came from an enormous family in Scotland. He had 11 brothers and sisters, and none of them had children. And which is saying something for the time. So as far as I know, yeah, he does not have relatives in the US other than maybe these distant cousins and so on. But at some point I was in an email correspondence with someone who was also trying to trace down sort of genealogical connections to Scottish thinkers. And we were both bemoaning the fact that once you start looking at Ogilvies, it just becomes a hopeless tangle of, relations and people with multiple names and so on. Just the number of James Ogilvies in the 18th century is mind-numbing. So, yeah.
Kristen asks if you know if Edgar Allan Poe ever saw him speak.
Oh, what a good question. No, I have no idea. It's possible, but although Poe would have been in Richmond probably during a period when Ogilvie was long gone. I mean, Ogilvie spent the bulk of his time in Richmond between about 1803 and 1805, 1806. And so I think, yes, I think that would have been maybe a little early for Poe to have heard him.
And one last question from Carl. Do you think that Ogilvie influenced Mark Twain's writing in Huckleberry Finn about the King and the Duke?
I wondered this, I mean, Ogilvie to many of his contemporaries was a bundle of contradictions. He was a remarkable thinker, but also somebody who was a remarkable had a remarkable memory, and so he could recite lines and lines and lines of poetry or biblical verse and so on. He for some people, they found that a kind of fakery or a kind of plagiarism. Other people found the whole performance transforming and moving. There's a lot of talk about being in the audience and having goosebumps raised on your arms, or a tear dropping down your cheek. And so I think that there are a lot of literary moments, not just from Huckleberry Finn, but from early 20th century people who write about these traveling fantasists or fakers or people selling whatever kind of patent medicine. There are all kinds of people with great speaking skills who are up to something. And it's not clear to me that Ogilvie is a direct reference there. I think by that time they had plenty of other references to work from, but who knows? I mean, yeah, I doubt it, but maybe.
Thank you so much, Carolyn. This has been so much fun, and I will turn things over to Angela.
Thank you.
Thank you, Carolyn. This has been fantastic. And thank you to everybody who joined us today and for, as always, your wonderful questions. And we'll see you next month.
Great. Thank you.
Bye, Carolyn.
Bye.